Alrighty, good afternoon everybody. My name is Karl Soule. I have been working for Adobe for a longer than I'd like to admit. This is actually my 20th NAB. So I've been up on stage for working with Adobe for quite a while, and in past lives have also been presenting here at NAB. My current job with Adobe is actually helping workflow in Hollywood, in the feature film, and in the broadcast television world. And I had the pleasure this last year to work with Billy Fox, Jamie Clark, John Carr, and the guys on the film that you just saw that little promotional piece for. It's called Only the Brave, distributed by Sony Pictures. Also exciting for me, it was my first IMDb credit, so I'm on there as like a workflow consultant. So just like the last name right before no animals were harmed in the making of this film. But still, just really nice to have the opportunity to work with these guys. And in doing so, it really brought to the forefront the fact that, you know, at Adobe, we do talk about all the different tools at Creative Cloud, how they all work together, and that you can work seamlessly between each of these tools. But the simple fact of the matter is, when you're working in Hollywood, where you have very siloed workflows, you have the best sound people working with the best color people, you need to be able to have a set of tools that interoperate and work together seamlessly. And so what I'm going to do for the next half hour is kind of talk about some of these special workflows that are driven in the professional space, where you need to work with a dailies system, get the files into editorial. An assistant has to sync up sound and picture as independent files. You have to deal with multicam, editing practices. Then there's the whole process of turning things over. If you're going to hand off your sound to a post-production facility like Skywalker, which is what was used in Only the Brave, you need to be able to do that and do it seamlessly. And the way these workflows work, you want to make sure you're making the right decisions at the beginning of the process so that it doesn't bite you later on. So I'm going to go through and kind of talk a little bit about these different workflows. A lot of this is stuff that I've gathered from best practices, not only on Only the Brave, but some network drama shows and some other projects that we kind of have in the pipeline that we're not publicly talking about yet. So to start with, getting involved with high-end editors, we've developed this Adobe Hollywood approach. Our team is located in Los Angeles. I'm based in Culver City. And we work with and we pick certain projects where we use those as sort of a proving ground, basically get these top-of-the-line editors to cut with Premiere, and if the software gets in the way in any way, we fix it. We come in and we'll develop a feature, we'll fix what needs to happen. So these guys get access to something a little bit early, but the benefit is for everybody here because those features all roll into the public version of Premiere in the next release. So in some cases, some of these editorial fixes you're going to see, I can actually go into Premiere and I can point to stuff and go, oh yeah, that was fixed for Gone Girl. Oh, that was something we added for Deadpool. So each of these different things, it just is how we've been able to evolve the software so rapidly, is all based on these customer-driven approaches, and it's really been part of our success. Now, starting with dailies, in a lot of places, the actual media files that we're going to be editing, there's a whole process of prepping those files ahead of time, taking the log, milky color that we're shooting. Everybody's shooting raw these days with red, with ARRI. So we need to be able to add some color that's going to be close to what the final color is going to look like, a nice starting point. Oftentimes, we're shooting files that are 4K, 5K, 5.7K, 6K, 8K. We're usually editing a lower resolution file. And so this idea of offline editorial, we need to be able to work with the dailies companies to get the files from set into Premiere and start working and start editing. In many cases, the dailies companies provide a whole laundry list of metadata with these files. So we need to have a way of bringing in the metadata and getting the files into Premiere. Not a lot of people know this, but Premiere can actually work with a file format called an ALE file. I'm just going to go ahead and create a folder here, a little blank folder. We're going to import some dailies. Rather than bringing in the files one by one, and dealing with the fact that these files have crazy file names that don't have any bearing in the real world. They don't have scene and take information. They don't have the names of the LUTs. They don't have the CDL values that might have been applied on set. Really, we need Premiere to operate almost like a spreadsheet with all of this metadata information, sound roll information, sound timecode information. The key to these workflows is using an ALE file. So if I use this ALE file, this is actually a human readable file. It's a log exchange file that you can actually open up in a text editor. You can see what's going on inside of it. I can import that into Premiere, and when I do, there's one step from here. I just have to link the media. An ALE file typically doesn't contain the actual location of the media, but it does contain the original file name, so that I can come in here and typically just link up one of these files and have everything come online for me. So now I can just double click on one of these clips. Now, if I bring the bin up full screen here, you can see that there's a lot of extra information in here. First off, the names of these clips, instead of being, C001 underscore B237, we can actually have just simple scene and take information, or scene, take, and camera information. However you like to have your files named, you can talk to the dailies house and set that up so that the files come in the way you want. Some other fields that come in that are really important: the name of the sound roll and the sound timecode information can come across in an ALE file. If I'm going to be syncing these dailies and have to rely on a separate auxiliary timecode information, this is a key way of getting this into Premiere in one easy step. Lastly, color information comes across in these files, so that if I'm using some kind of a LUT on site, these values that you see here, these crazy numbers, those are actually part of something called CDL values, and Premiere supports CDL values. In fact, I'll take this one step further. Let me create one other bin here. And inside of this bin, I'm going to import another set of clips via an ALE file. And in this case, I'm working with RE ProRes footage. If you were to look at the original source media, it looks very milky, very washed out. Now, this is what the camera sees directly, but obviously the colorist, the cinematographer on set, is applying LUTs to this. They're also applying things called these CDL values. It's kind of like tweaking the old knobs on a proc amp, for any of my longtime people out there that remember what a proc amp is. If I import an ALE file, and again, just link the media. We'll go into this folder, this folder, there's the clip, link to that. And if I take these files and throw them on a timeline, you'll see that these files actually have different color values that are actually being applied to these clips. They don't have that milky look to them. Now, if I match frame into this clip, you'll see that we actually have a special effect inside of Premiere Pro, so that we can automatically apply CDL values to the files. If that's in the ALE file, when you link the media, it's going to automatically lay that color information over the top non-destructively. And this is something that I can actually turn on and off, so that if I need to go back and see what the log footage looks like, I can do that. Now, we're not automatically adding LUTs, except for in one use case dealing with a certain ARRI camera. But that's kind of the next step with this, is we're working towards, and we're proving out some things now, where you could actually have your dailies stay in log and apply all this color information non-destructively, so that you can turn it on and off if you need to go back and want to redo color as you're going through editorial. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is merging clips. Once I've brought my clips into Premiere and I need to synchronize the clips, Premiere provides a lot of different ways of doing this. There's one way we really recommend when you're working inside of Hollywood. If you want to do synchronization of sound and picture, if some of your clips are single camera, some of them are multi-camera, you can do all of this in a single batch process using Multicam. We really recommend using Multicam if you're planning on turning over your audio to a secondary source, because multicams can pass all of the original metadata information from the source media into the turnovers so that they can then link back to the original sound roll information. So really quickly, if I want to link up some audio and video, I'll just do a quick example of one clip here. I can create a multi-camera with this. It's a single camera with separate sound roll information, but I can still use multi-camera to synchronize this. Now, if I have matching time code, I can batch process 87 shots in about 10 seconds by using multicam. If I don't have matching time code, but the audio is different, I don't have a lot of secondary takes, I could use audio for doing this. I can also sync based on sound time code if I used an ALE file to begin with to bring in my dailies, because all my clips are going to have that sound roll information associated with them. So there's a lot of power hidden inside the multi-camera source sequence. The last bit of this to note is down at the bottom where it says sequence settings, camera 1. If I am dealing with ISO mics and I'm bringing those in as a separate WAV file, camera 1 is the setting you want to choose, because this will automatically choose the audio. If you have an audio only file as part of your selection, that becomes camera 1. So this will automatically mute the original camera audio and just pass through what I want, which are the ISOs. So I'll go ahead and, let me do that one more time. Grab these two clips, multi-camera source sequence. I don't have matching time code in this case. I'm going to go ahead and use the audio. Now this is the last setting that I also want to showcase here. This is where we can pass through the clip names. So by selecting this, the audio sound information is going to pass through wherever I'm cutting in multicam. So go ahead and let that process. It'll generate a multicam, and I can load this up in my source monitor, and I can actually start playing this back. But multicams in Premiere have the added benefit that I can actually open this up into a timeline view, because if you've ever dealt with timecode drift, where suddenly you've done all your synchronization, everything looks great on 80% of your shots, and then you realize when the crew came back for lunch, somebody must have plugged and unplugged the jam sync cable, and now everything's off by 5 frames. We can fix that. An assistant can actually open up any multicam in a timeline view, and if you need to nudge the audio track, you can actually come in here and easily do that using the multicam view. So you have the full capability of modifying or changing things inside of your multicams using Adobe Premiere. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some editing finesse tricks here, because one of the things that's been great about this whole process of working with top-level editors is it's given us the ability to prioritize certain long-standing feature requests inside of Premiere as we engage with a particular team of editors. And again, part of our job as the Adobe Hollywood team is to allow the editors to just edit, and if the software gets in the way, we come in and make changes to allow for that. So some of these things are really, really tiny, but I'm always amazed when I showcase them. People go, "You can do that in Premiere?" Because in a lot of cases, these aren't really top-level features that get put into the marketing literature, but they really help on an editorial level. The first one I want to showcase, there's actually a .01 release that came out in January that had about 8 or 9 of these features that actually came from the feedback on a top-level network drama show that we worked on as kind of a pilot project. But this one just has to do with moving clips around on the timeline. If you've ever had to pick up a clip and move it up and down on the timeline with the mouse, you know that there's always that possibility of it slipping a frame or two off to the left or the right. Now you can simply hold down the Shift key and drag that up and down. Finally. Thank you. It is such a really silly, stupid, easy thing, but it was one of those things that, again, working with some editors, we saw how important that was. We were able to jump in and fix it. Now, the next one I want to talk about, this is something that oftentimes happens deep in the creative process. You've got a really complex sequence with multiple tracks of video, multiple tracks of audio, and you suddenly are looking at this going, you know, this scene really would play better in this part of the image, of the sequence. And making that precise selection, cutting it out surgically from one part of a sequence and moving it when you've got so many different clips to work with, can be a challenge if you're trying to use the mouse, if you're trying to move it around. It'd be really nice if I could just take a chunk of the timeline, load it in the source monitor, and then move it to a different location. We now have a keyboard shortcut that allows for that. If I go to my keyboard shortcuts and do something called make subsequence from in to out. Now this is the important bit. This keyboard shortcut right now, because every editor we talked to had a different default location they wanted it to, we just left it blank. It's not something that's mapped by default. A lot of people, as they switch to Premiere, they struggle with the keyboard a little bit. I always tell them, remember way back the first editing software you worked on, you probably spent about a month dialing in the keyboard. I've talked to many editors on different platforms. I've never seen the same keyboard layout in any editing room. So if you're switching to Premiere, keep in mind that this is your friend, and you're going to be spending your first week or so kind of remapping the keyboard to what you're familiar with. Keep your muscle memory. Don't think you have to rely on the defaults in Premiere. Everything is modifiable, and there's a lot of functionality that's hidden inside of this. I work with one editor that uses the up, down, left, and right arrows to jump into the trim monitor and do ripple trims, and it was amazingly effective, and I saw that and just said, wow. And it was something that, you know, at first the question was, you can't do that in Premiere, right? And within 5 minutes, we got everything mapped, and it did exactly what she wanted. So keep that in mind as you're using Premiere. There are a lot of these little hidden gems. So if I have this map now to Control U, basically what I can do here is find the point that I want to work with. Maybe like the middle of this clip here, I want to mark that as an in point. I've got my out point already selected. So now when I do Control U, it loads exactly what I have here. It ignores track targeting. It just grabs everything that I have and loads it up in the source monitor. I can view this in timeline view to see, you know, here this timeline is the source monitor timeline. And so now I can see there's the whole scene grabbed in one easy step. So if I go back to the sequence I was just working with, I could do a lift or extract on everything that I have here. And then I could come over here to where I want to insert this and do an insert edit and drop that scene in a different location. All in one quick and easy step. So these are the types of things that the Hollywood team adds to the software. It's an ongoing process. Double check the release notes. Anytime you even see like a .01 update from Adobe, chances are there's a couple of these that have come in because of a feature film engagement or a television engagement that we're doing. Now let's talk a little bit about project locking, because this was something that we actually prototyped and started working with on Only the Brave. One of the things that we definitely saw was the need for a local collaboration tool. Now Adobe has a wonderful service available called Team Projects, and if you want to know more about that, that's more for distance collaboration, and that's around the back of the booth. But it became apparent that when you're in a facility, you're all editing off of shared storage, we needed to have some better tools in place so that the assistant editors and the lead editors weren't stepping on top of each other. And really these guys wanted something that they already kind of knew how it worked, they just wanted it a little bit better. So what we designed, we actually went in and redesigned Premiere Pro so that we can have multiple projects open at the same time so that you can easily drag and drop stuff from one to the other. But we also introduced this concept of project locking and the concept of a master project. So what I have here is sort of a special use case of a Premiere Pro project. There's no media in this project. There's no sequences in this project. This project opens in about 1.5 seconds because everything else is actually in other projects on the drive. If you think about what you traditionally think of a bin as, A bin usually has sequences and media inside of it. Well, what does a Premiere Pro project have? Premiere Pro projects don't have like a master frame rate or resolution. They're independent of that. They really just have master clips and sequences. So what we've done is basically allowed for the ability to create these shortcuts, which we call shared projects. So my master project, all the editors can open the master project at the same time and then dive in the particular part of the project that they want to work inside. So this should look very familiar to long-standing editors in Hollywood. If somebody is working on Reel 1, it looks like Niels from earlier today was editing Reel 1 on the other workstation, and he's still logged in and doing that. I can jump into Reel 2 and start working on selects in Reel 2 at the same time that he's working on Reel 1. Now, what's great about this workflow is it's impossible to step on each other. And if I come back and try opening Reel 1, I can open it. It'll tell me that it's locked. If I try and make any changes to this, it's not going to let me make changes. Why? Because there's a nice little lock icon on that particular sequence. I can look in the master project at the project lock column, see the name of the person. If they unlock it, all I have to do is click the lock icon, and now I have access to read write to that project. So all of that work, again, that came from the Adobe Hollywood team. We felt it was necessary. While team projects is very forward-thinking, for an audience that's very risk-averse in Hollywood, we wanted to give them something that was familiar, and now it exists inside of Premiere Pro. Let's talk a little bit about working in different aspect ratios, because nowadays, I can remember there was a certain point in television where you pretty much had one format that you delivered to. Well, we've gone way past that now. We're shooting in anamorphic 4:3 at 5.7K on different cameras. So we have these files. We have sequences that we're delivering at in something that's 2:3:9 aspect ratio, 2:4:0 aspect ratio. So there's a wide mix of different file formats. Very common to shoot in these overscan file formats and then do some repositioning of your shots in post. David Fincher does this all the time with all their shots. They actually shot in 6K, framed everything for 5K, did the actual editorial work at 2.7K. 2.7K was their proxy file. That still just boggles my mind. I know I'm old, but yeah. So this is very, very common to work in a different resolution. I remember with Only the Brave, I believe the footage was shot 2K by 1080, and it was edited in 1920 by 858, if memory serves right. Don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. I get a little fuzzy with the numbers sometimes, just too many of them. Here I've got an example of some 1920 by 1080 footage, but we're actually using a sequence in this case, which is a 2:1 aspect ratio at 1920 by 960. Now, the beauty of Premiere is we don't have set resolutions that you can operate in. You can create a sequence of virtually any size that you actually want to deliver in, and Premiere will take your footage. If you don't scale it by default, it will give you a nice center cut extraction, and then you can reposition and frame it from there. So the key to doing this, and this also goes for pixel aspect ratio. So if you've worked in anamorphic, if you shot in anamorphic, you can actually work in an anamorphic timeline. And that way, as you start to do repositioning, if you start to do visual effect shots, you can everything can stay in anamorphic throughout the entire process. So here I've got an anamorphic timeline. I want to kind of check my headroom on this shot. All I have to do is match frame, and I can see the original framing of the shot. I can see in this case, I actually have some room to kind of pan this around. I could pan left and right on this particular instance to kind of reframe this shot as necessary. So in the program monitor, I get to see what my final cut is going to look like. On any of my outputs, I'll see that. when I move over to the source monitor, I can see the full frame so I can make decisions about what I'm working on. All right, let's start talking a little bit about turnovers. Now, part of this workflow, if I'm going to be turning things over, Adobe Premiere supports a number of different formats. So for exporting out, we do still support something called OMF. And OMF can actually save situations where you haven't merged the files correctly, you've renamed your original source media. It still is a valid workflow in certain circumstances, but it's really a deprecated format. It's not a format the modern workflows should be using. Again, it's always a backup, kind of a fail-safe. But what you should be using is an AAF workflow if you're going out to something like Pro Tools. Now, using AAF, if you have synced your audio using Multicam, all the metadata from the source media will automatically flatten, and it will export in the AAF with the correct file names so that you can relink back to the original source media. Now, we had one instance in there, and it's a really technical thing, where that wasn't really happening. It was only in a very special use case, and I would go in and train assistants on how to handle that one-off, two-off case when it would happen. We're happy to say we're pretty sure we fixed that, any other instances, so I don't even have to manually go in and flatten my clips in the timeline from Multicam to original source. It'll do that automatically on the AAF export. So you should be able to use that. Now, of course, this is Adobe, and we do have a wonderful digital audio workstation within the Creative Cloud itself called Adobe Audition. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the Audition team has really worked hard to make that audio turnover process as seamless as possible. And part of that, it is now possible in Adobe Audition without even doing an export from Premiere. I can now import a Premiere Pro project direct into Adobe Audition and get full timeline fidelity, keyframes, everything that's inside of the Premiere Pro project. I actually am working directly with the same media, so all of the clips come across with each of the individual channels. So even if I'm in a situation where I had 8 ISO mics on set and I'm only cutting in A1 and A2 into my timeline, I can go back in Audition and easily pull 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 and bring in and substitute out different mics very, very easily. So this ability for Premiere sequences to actually be opened and read inside of Adobe Audition directly without doing any type of interchange format is something brand new in this 2018.1 release that we introduced at the show we introduced last week. Now, talking about color turnovers, again, with this workflow, I need to be able to not only send the edit across, I also need to be able to send color information, CDL values. If I'm using LUTs on my clips, I need to be able to do that. So using the metadata columns that we have in the project, we're still using a lot of very common workflow that we see in Hollywood. And it pains me to say that in 2018, I'm still exporting EDL files, but the fact of the matter is, you go with what works, right? EDLs, we've made a lot of improvements to the EDL panel, being able to use this as a modern interchange format, including 32 character names. But most importantly, things like sound roll information can come across now, as well as CDL values, LUTs, and so on. So while this is a very old format that dates back to the 1970s, I want to say, in 76 is when CMX 3600 started. It's still a tool in a modern arsenal to be able to, again, seamlessly hand something off to somebody else, and we definitely support it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is actual export. And if you were here at the beginning and you saw the piece with Jamie Clark, the assistant editor on Only the Brave, he talked about the fact that they did audio turnover, or they did screenings using DCP files. And the normal process of creating a DCP or digital cinema package is to take your edit, send the audio and video off to a third party. About a 72-hour turnaround, they're able to create the digital cinema package that's ready to go to a theater, load up on the projector, and you're ready to go. One of the things that Joe Kaczynski, the director on that piece, that Billy Fox, really big believers in, is trying to get the screening looking and sounding exactly the way they want it to for their final export. And that meant oftentimes working right up as close to the screening as possible. So if you sent out the files for the DCP 72 hours earlier, you've made a bunch of advancements in the story already, and now you're actually watching the screening with a bunch of people, and you know that this has actually changed dramatically from where it was a couple days ago. So with Premiere, they were able to use the export option in Media Encoder and Premiere to save out directly to a Raptor DCP file inside of Premiere Pro and generate the DCP package. There's a secondary step with this. For security reasons, DCPs do not require encryption, but if you're doing a screening of something that hasn't been released yet, you probably want to do encryption. There is an open source tool out there called DCP-O-Matic, which if you hand it an already produced DCP file from Adobe Premiere and Adobe Media Encoder, all it has to do is add that wrapping, add that encryption layer. It's really, really fast. The total time it took from the time they would stop editing to have that finished DCP file was around 4 hours for a feature-length film, 4 to 6 hours. So this meant you could get a closer cut to what was current out for your screening. And while Only the Brave wasn't very successful in the box office, the preview screenings, the ratings on Rotten Tomatoes have been absolutely fantastic with this movie. And I credit a lot of that for the fact that they were always trying to make sure all the previews looked as good as possible as they were going out and working. This included doing temp color in Premiere, 5.1 surround sound inside of Premiere Pro. Again, we work in an industry where all of this stuff can be temporary in Premiere, so you think, we don't have to make it that great. But from a preview point of view, you always want to try and get the best possible preview scores, and that was a big part of what we did. Guys, I'm completely out of time. We have a wonderful presenter coming up next, 2 presenters coming up next. Thank you guys so much. My name's Karl Soule.